Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 244. The Housebreaker. May Eileen Wood was dubbed in the press as the Notorious Woman Housebreaker. She was born in Busselton, Western Australia in 1895 to John Wood and Ellen Thurkle. Her parents married at Carradale, Western Australia, 4 years after her birth. It seems she had a twin who did not survive and a younger sister, Ivy, who was born 9 years after her in Western Australia. May's Victorian jail record stated she was born in Queensland in 1897. She was only 11 when her father died. Eileen married Victor Mulholland, a shoemaker, on the 16th of August 1919 at Redfern, New South Wales, soon after moving from Melbourne to Sydney. Interestingly, on her marriage certificate, John Wood, a Church of England clergyman, was crossed out as her father, and Robert Jackson was placed in there instead. She stated on this marriage certificate she was born in New Zealand. Victor was 6 years older than her. On the 8th of November 1919 in the Sydney Morning Herald, to a charge of breaking and entering 3 houses at Kensington on 3 different occasions and stealing therein, Eileen May Mulholland, a young married woman, pled guilty. It was stated that the accused husband made her a liberal allowance and it was believed that she was a kleptomaniac. His Honour ordered the accused to be placed under observation. She was given a fine which her husband paid and he was bound over on a good behaviour bond for her. However, on the 27th of November 1919, she's photographed at the State Reformatory for Women at Long Bay. On the 3rd of December 1919, Eileen May Mulholland, alias May Mulholland, 25, charged with breaking and entering the dwelling of Alan James Rollo and stealing goods to the value of £25, partly recovered, has been arrested by Sydney Police, further charged with breaking and entering the dwelling house of Charlotte Peters and stealing jewellery and clothing, valued at £25, part recovered, and breaking and entering the dwelling house of George Eves and stealing clothing and jewellery, valued at £30, partly recovered, and also breaking and entering the dwelling house of Ormond Gilmore and stealing clothing and jewellery to the value of £30. So as a result of those 4 charges, she was given 12 months light labour in Long Bay. And there was a note saying His Honour said that if the husband can get some responsible person to look after her, that he would recommend an early release. She was released only 3 months later on licence on the 20th of February 1920, but began stealing again. She appeared in a number of Sydney police courts in April 1920, accused of stealing fur coats, clothing and jewellery to the value of £900. And on the 1st of April 1920, in the Sydney Evening News, jewellery worth £300. Emma Rolfe, 23, appeared before Mr Butler at the Central Police Court this morning on a charge of having stolen on March 30th from the dwelling of Kitty Pittar at Coogee 2 diamond rings and a pair of diamond eardrops at the total value of £300. Applying for a remand, Sergeant Spire, the police prosecutor, said that he'd been informed that the accused was employed by Mrs Pittar as ladies' help. The jewellery was removed when Mrs Pittar was in town. It is alleged that the portion of the jewellery had been pawned and some of it the accused was wearing when she was arrested. It's all been recovered. So in the Sydney Quarter Sessions, Mulholland, alias Emma Rolfe, was sentenced to 18 months light labour in total, with 2 charges of break and enter and 3 charges of larceny. Judge Scholes commented that the only way to bring about a recovery in your case is to send you to jail and thus protect the public from your particular attention. She was released from the State Reformatory on the 21st of September 1921. Victor owned a shoe manufacturing company at Surrey Hills called the Victory Shoe Company in December 1921. However, Eileen did not stay in Sydney with her husband. She returned to Melbourne, where she also ran afoul of the law. There were numerous court appearances for housebreaking and stealing under the names of Eileen Woods and Eileen Evans. On the 14th of February 1922 in the Melbourne Argus,
Clothing valued at £177 was stolen from the home of Mrs. Rose Taft in St Kilda on the 24th of January. Yesterday at St Kilda, Mrs. Taft saw a young woman wearing a dress that she identified as her own property. She informed the police and the young woman was followed and questioned. She told the police she'd bought the costume from a young woman at Hawthorn who'd advertised in the newspaper that she'd had several frocks for sale. With this information, the police in St Kilda and in Russell Street went to Hawthorn. Later at the St Kilda Watch House, Eileen Wood, a young woman, was charged with having stolen clothing valued at £177 from Mrs. Rose Taft. For this, she served a 12-month sentence in November 1922 for 3 counts of receiving. She was released on remission on the 12th of January 1923. But by the 27th of April 1923, the Melbourne General Sessions, Mulholland was sentenced to 3 counts of housebreaking and received 12 months, each cumulative, therefore serving 3 years imprisonment. She was declared an habitual criminal in Victoria, and in the following month she was again before the court with 10 more housebreaking charges, but her sentence was not extended. Her method of operation seemed to have stayed the same throughout her criminal career. She targeted clothing, jewellery and small items that could be taken to pawn shops and sold quickly. She was an opportunist when in employment and quick of hand when it came to shoplifting. She targeted houses in wealthier suburbs and dressed like the locals so as to not stand out. On the 28th of April 1923 in the Melbourne Argus, woman housebreaker Eileen Evans found guilty. On the 23rd of March, Mrs. Gardner of Hawthorn was at her front door when a stylishly dressed young woman called and asked if the next-door neighbour, Mrs. Fricky, was at home. Mrs. Gardner said she did not think so. The caller replied that it was most unfortunate, and Mrs. Gardner added that Mrs. Fricky would be sorry to miss her. Both these statements turned out to be true. When Mrs. Fricky returned, she missed more than the caller. The lead light at the front of the hall was broken and about £35 worth of property stolen. Yesterday, the caller, not so stylishly dressed, according to one witness, appeared in the dock in the criminal court upon 8 charges of housebreaking and 1 count of receiving stolen goods. She gave the name of Eileen Evans and her age of 24 years. In a long and eventful struggle with the forces of law and order, she'd given other names, including Eileen Wood's. The charges against her were breaking into the house of Mrs. Fricky of Hawthorn on the 23rd of March and stealing £35 worth of property, breaking into the house of James Roach of Camberwell on the 23rd of February and stealing £25 worth of property, breaking into the home of David Nightingale of Kew on the 18th of January and stealing £85 worth of property, breaking into the house of John King of Kew on the 19th of March and stealing £95 worth of property, breaking into the house of James Riddle of Kew on the 12th of March, stealing £75 worth of goods, breaking into the house of F. Garnham of Hawthorn on the 21st of March and stealing about £20 worth of goods, breaking into the house of James Hackett of Kew on the 26th of March and stealing £126 worth of goods, breaking into the house of Mrs. Rennick of Hawthorn on the 28th of February and stealing £33 worth of property. The goods were displayed and made up a remarkable collection. Discrimination had been displayed in the selection of women's clothing, and there was much jewellery, a camera, and a large assortment of silverware of the class that happy young couples collect as wedding presents. Evans pled not guilty to all the charges and was undefended. Mr. McIndoe, in opening the case, said that the count of receiving was merely alternative. If the jury found her guilty of having broken into the houses and stealing the goods, they need not trouble themselves about the receiving. He thought that they would not have the least trouble in finding her guilty of the charges of housebreaking. Evans was what was known to the police as a lead light expert. She broke the lead light of the passage and by inserting her hands opened the door by turning the lock. The stolen goods had been found in her rooms at East Melbourne and she'd been seen near some of the houses at just about the time the robberies had been committed. Evans, in evidence, denied that she'd stolen any of the goods. They had, she said, been left in her rooms by Mr. and Mrs. Murcott, who bought for a second-hand house in Sydney. "Is that scissors with the broken point yours?" Evans said, "I had one something like it." Justice MacArthur asked, "But is it yours?" Evans said, "I cannot swear. It is like mine." Justice MacArthur said, "It must be yours unless the constable committed deliberate perjury, for he says that he took it out of your bag." Mr. McIndoe said, "If it is yours, it is a mere coincidence that the missing point was found on the lead light of Mr. King's door." "Yes," she answered. "You are the victim of a remarkable string of coincidences. It is a coincidence that the stolen property was all found in your house." "Yes." "And a coincidence that you were seen near some of the houses just at the time the robberies took place?" "Yes." "Then the scissors are another coincidence?" "Yes." The jury found Evans guilty on all 8 charges of housebreaking and stealing. She was remanded for sentence. Evans said her real name was Woods and admitted to a remarkable list of prior convictions. Either in the courts or summary jurisdiction or in the higher courts, she seems to have been exceptionally fortunate in the judges who meted out sentences. In 1914, she was released on bond twice and had her sentence suspended once. The charge in each case was for some form of larceny, apparently from a dwelling. Having concluded that, she exhausted the leniency of the Victorian courts and went to Sydney, where she was found 6 times guilty of housebreaking or stealing from homes under the name of May Mulholland. For one theft, she was fined £3. Twice she was sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment, and twice in later times to 12 months imprisonment. In March last year at Hawthorn, she was sentenced to 12 months imprisonment for receiving and was released at the end of the year. Eileen was released on the 9th of December 1925, and it seems she was reconciled with her husband Victor as she gave birth to a boy, Victor Raymond Mulholland, on the 31st of December 1926 in Melbourne. Just 2 weeks later, though, she was arrested under the name of Jessie Hinton and sentenced to another 12 months jail. On the 2nd of February 1927 in the Melbourne Argus, Jessie Minton, alias Eileen Woods, alias Eileen Evans, aged 30 years, who was arrested while on parole under the Indeterminate Sentences Act, was charged at the Prahran Court on Tuesday with having broken into the dwelling of Wilhelmina Slythe of East St Kilda on the 25th of January and stolen furs, clothing and jewellery valued at £58. Mrs. Slythe said at 3:30 on the afternoon of the date in question, "After having securely locked the doors and windows of my home, I went out. On returning about 20 minutes later, I saw a woman leaving the front gate carrying my suitcase. I found my wardrobe wide open and articles of wearing apparel missing. Returning to the street, I saw the woman running towards Dandenong Road. I chased her but could not catch her. I saw Constable Broderick and told him, and he went after the woman. Entrance was gained to the house by breaking the lead light of a door. Subsequently, at the Armidale police station, I recognised the accused as the woman I saw coming out of my gate. Constable Broderick said, in consequence of something Mrs. Slythe told me, I followed the accused on a bicycle from Dandenong Road to the intersection of High Street and Highbury Grove. She was holding a suitcase produced as if waiting for a tram. I said, 'Where did you get that suitcase?' Putting the case on the ground, she said, 'I do not own it.' She also said that she did not know who owned it. She had the wallet produced in her hand. While my attention was diverted, the accused ran across High Street into a lane off Chatsworth Road. As I reached her, she appeared as if she'd thrown something over a fence. The accused said, 'I'll give you £50 if you let me go. It will be more to you than if you put me in jail.' I later recovered the wallet, which contained some articles of jewellery belonging to Mrs. Slythe. Plainclothes Constable Lackery of Prahran said, when I questioned the accused in regard to this and other matters, she said, 'This is the only job I've done for some time.' Minton pled not guilty and was committed for trial at the Supreme Court on the 15th of February, with bail allowed at £200 and 2 sureties of £100 each. The accused was also remanded for 7 days to appear at the City Court to answer a charge of having stolen a woman's frock, valued at £16, the property of Cairns Company Limited of Swanston Street. Minton was further charged with having stolen property valued at £25 from the dwelling of Charles Smithison of Flemington on the 29th of June 1924, but as Sergeant Tennant said that he had no evidence to offer for the prosecution, the charge was withdrawn. So on the 24th of February 1927, she was recommitted to the reformatory prison for breaching her parole, and she needed to serve 1 year in jail. Victor returned to Sydney with their son. She was released on the 8th of December 1927 with 1/6 of her sentence granted as remission. In February and March 1929, she was charged in Melbourne for riotous conduct and destroying government property and was given 6 months in the reformatory prison. She was then jailed for 3 years under the name Jean Harris on an old break and enter charge in April 1932. This Victorian jail record said she was single and had no previous convictions, so the aliases actually worked a treat for her. In 1932, having made 2 previous but unsuccessful applications, Victor petitioned for divorce on the grounds of desertion. Eileen had been living in Sydney with their son when she was arrested for shoplifting in the department store David Jones. The Mulhollands' divorce proceedings were highlighted in the press, and Eileen was referred to as the Notorious Woman Housebreaker. She was described as a vivacious woman with flashing eyes and a scornful tongue. Eileen denied that she'd deserted her husband, and she charged him with having committed adultery. On the 20th of February 1933 in the Sydney Sun, 2 weeks after his marriage, his wife had been arrested on a charge of stealing, said Victor Horace Mulholland, an Erskineville boot manufacturer, in the divorce court today. He paid her fines at the Newtown court, he said, but later she was arrested again on 3 stealing charges. Mulholland petitioned for the dissolution of his marriage with May Eileen Mulholland, formerly Wood, on the grounds of desertion. Mrs. Mulholland appeared in custody and denied the charges against her and alleged against her husband misconduct with 2 women. These allegations were denied by Mulholland. Mulholland said that after his wife had been sentenced to a year's jail for housebreaking, he went to America, arranging for his mother to provide for his wife on her release. In 1926, he took out divorce papers but agreed to take her back. She took a position as a nurse in a private hospital and then returned to Melbourne where her baby was born. A few weeks later, he said, he heard she was in prison and he took possession of the baby. On her release, he allowed her to have the child and paid her £4 a week. One day, when he went to pay the money, he said detectives walked in and arrested her. Last August, she was sentenced on a charge of breaking and entering. Mrs. Mulholland said that when she was arrested shortly after the marriage, her husband had refused to bail her out. When he went to America, he'd made no arrangements for her support and warned her not to go near his mother. She was in a certain state of health, she added, and was sent from prison to the Salvation Army home and ran away and went to Melbourne. In 1922, Mulholland sent her a little money for a while, she said, but the payments ceased and she got into trouble again. Mrs. Mulholland admitted that she had been declared an habitual criminal. Eileen said that she remained in jail in Victoria for 3.5 years because her husband would not agree to her release. And 2 days later, on the 22nd of February 1933 in the Sydney Sun, the deliberate kicking of a witness in the divorce court today was alleged during the resumed hearing of the Mulholland divorce suit. The incident, it was stated, had taken place when Mrs. May Eileen Mulholland had left the witness box. She came past me and deliberately kicked me on the leg. It was a hard kick, declared Mary Madeline O'Brien, with whom Mrs. Mulholland is charging with misconduct. Mulholland, in evidence, said that last year his wife had gone to the factory and had caused a terrible scene. She'd accused him of running around with Molly O'Brien and he'd been forced to call the police. Miss O'Brien was scared. Miss O'Brien was Mulholland's bookkeeper and said that in January Mrs. Mulholland had telephoned her and tried to make an appointment with her in town. She said she could not go, and Mrs. Mulholland had retorted that she was coming down to slash her with a razor. She'd phoned the Newtown police and they sent out a policeman to guard her. Miss O'Brien denied all of the wife's allegations of misconduct. And then another article saying the testimony of both sides in the case concluded on Wednesday afternoon in the divorce suit of Mulholland versus Mulholland. His Honour intimated that he would reserve judgment in the matter. The hearing was a remarkable and sensational one in every respect. Tastefully dressed in brown with touches of expensive fur at her neck and wrists, Mrs. Mulholland presented a striking figure of sombre beauty as her classic features pale with emotion. She admitted convictions under the criminal calendar, absconding from bail and adopting various aliases. She formed a strong contrast to Miss O'Brien, whose less sophisticated type of beauty was set off by a girlish blue dress and a white, wide-brimmed Panama hat. Of ruddy complexion, thick-set build and with a worried expression, Mulholland plunged straight into the story of his marital woes after recalling that they first lived at Stanmore. Other particulars showed that Mulholland was the son of a civil servant named James Frederick Mulholland, and his wife was the daughter of John Wood, clergyman deceased. Mulholland stated that there was a child of the marriage named Victor, who was 6 years old and living with him. He informed his wife that he was going to serve divorce papers on her and took out a petition on the grounds of her alleged desertion and the sentence she'd served. She cried bitterly, Mulholland recalled, and said she would be a good wife if I took her back. A reconciliation was effected and they engaged a flat at Darlinghurst where they lived together for 2 or 3 weeks happily. After that, and of her own volition, Mrs. Mulholland took a position as a nurse at Dr. Maitland's private hospital and then a similar situation at the institution in North Sydney. His efforts to get her to return to him were unsuccessful, and later, without any explanation, she told him she was going to Melbourne. He next saw her in Melbourne in the December, at the time the child was born. When he left his wife, it was with the promise she would return to Sydney and join him. He gave her £50, however he subsequently received a telephone message which caused him to go back to the southern capital and return to Sydney with the baby, he having heard that Mrs. Mulholland was once again behind bars. Mulholland explained that he understood that his wife, under the name of Jessie Minton, was sentenced to a year's hard labour on the 15th of February 1927 on a charge of receiving at the Supreme Court in Melbourne. The next time Mulholland saw his wife, it appeared, was in October 1930 when she came to the flat he was occupying at Rushcutters Bay. She said she came to see the child. I asked her if she was going to make a home, and she didn't give any definite answer. His little son disappeared and to be found with its mother in Darlinghurst. You can have him for 6 months to see if you can keep out of bad company, he said. He told her, adding that one morning while he was paying her usual £4 a week maintenance, 3 detectives arrested her, and at the Central Police Court on August 25th, 1931, she was fined for goods in custody. She was later arrested and fined again, this time from shoplifting from David Jones, on the 18th of August 1932 and was sentenced to 3 years hard labour for breaking and entering a dwelling. Mr. E. Little, who appeared for Mrs. Mulholland, asked Mr. Mulholland, "Did you ever write to your wife while she was in jail and say that you had met another woman and didn't want her to go back home?" "No." With the pallor of jail walls upon her cheeks, but smartly dressed in a brown coat and skirt with touches of expensive fur at the wrist and neck, Mrs. Mulholland took her stand in the witness box on her own behalf. After the marriage, she commenced trouble began early, but her husband overlooked it. His brother bailed me out that time, she swore, because my husband refused to and said he wouldn't be mixed up in it. I lived with him for 3 months and then there was more trouble. No one bailed me out that time. My husband said the police had told him that I was running about with men and he would have nothing to do with it. At the sessions, my husband pleaded with the judge for my release because I was in a certain condition, and the judge said he would release me if I could get a responsible person. My husband wouldn't help me. Then he wrote and told me he was going to America and not to go near his mother. Because of my condition, I was sent to the Salvation Army home, but I ran away from there as I didn't want to have a child there. I was afraid of what would happen to it. In 1923, continued Mrs. Mulholland, she went to Melbourne and saw her husband one day in Swanston Street. He said he'd only returned from America that day and told me that he was going to see my mother, but I said there was no use. She is not talking to me because I ran away and married you. He suggested we make a home. He went to Sydney and sent me a little money for a few weeks, and then the money stopped. I was worried and then I got into trouble again. Mrs. Mulholland had 3 petitions for divorce served on her. One when she was in prison, one in 1926, when she was in Melbourne, and the present one. It was before the service of the first petition, she emphasised, that I wrote and said that he wasn't making a home for me, and I was in a state of constant mental strain, and the best thing for him to do was divorce me. He replied that he hoped I would have a happy life and he would try and get a divorce. In answer to her counsel, Mr. Little, Mrs. Mulholland swore that when she told her husband that she was in a certain condition and knew that she would get a sentence, he said, "You had better go to Melbourne." This was in June 1926. "Did he send you any money in Melbourne?" She said now and then he did. In reply to another question, the respondent stated that her husband had always put her off when the question of making a home arose. When did the first discussion occur about Molly O'Brien? The first occasion was in January 1921. The other occasion was at Coogee when he said she was a useful asset and that there was nothing in it and that she was fond of the child. He said he had to go with someone while I was away and it might as well be her. He said he would get rid of her. While they were living at Coogee, continued Mrs. Mulholland, she was arrested in the presence of her husband during August 1931. After the case was heard, he came to her and told her he was responsible for Molly O'Brien's condition. I said I'd get a divorce, Mrs. Mulholland told His Honour. I had him watched by a private detective, but he didn't furnish reports as I didn't have the money to pay him. However, she went on, she again lived with her husband as I tried to see it in his way. He said I'd put him in the way of temptation. Mrs. Mulholland then came to her evidence in support of allegations of adultery against her husband. One Saturday, she said she could not recall the date. She went with a Mrs. West to Darlinghurst between 10 and 11 a.m, and on entering, she saw a woman, not Molly O'Brien. She was in her nightgown, swore the woman in the witness box. A double bed was unmade, and you could see where two people had slept. Her underclothes were on the bed and his pyjamas. I had a conversation with the girl. My husband was not present. On a Sunday, subsequently, added Mrs. Mulholland, her husband told her that he was going to cut her throat, and in referring to the Grosvenor Court incident, he maintained there was nothing in it. We quarrelled, and then I tried to look at it his way. He knocked me about and bruised me, and I had to go to the Malong Hospital. He paid the fees shortly after something happened to me. That was in 1921. Reverting back to her evidence, Mrs. Mulholland informed the court that in June 1926 her husband advised her to give herself up to the police and things would be different. She saw Detective Thompson, told him that there was a warrant out for her arrest, left her address with the police and remained at Bellevue Hill till she appeared in court after the warrant was executed. About March of the following year, she saw her husband frequently at Darlinghurst, and from there she went to Long Bay Jar, where she began the sentence she was presently serving. Prior to this, however, continued Mrs. Mulholland, about a week after she saw Miss O'Brien at the flat of her sister-in-law at Hampton Court in King's Cross. She called at the address on the 3rd floor, and in response to her knock, Miss O'Brien, who was a typist in her husband's employ, opened the door. She had a kimono on, she was undressed, and my husband was at the back of her and slammed the door. He was in his pyjamas. On the Monday following, she called at her husband's office at the factory and opened the door and saw Miss O'Brien and her husband together. I said things to her I shouldn't have. The police came. My husband said he was a friend of Detective Miller's and they told them about my convictions. Mr. Patterson began his cross-examination. He said, "In 1914, before your marriage, you had 2 convictions for larceny." "Certainly not," was her indignant reply. The respondent, however, admitted that she had absconded from bail on one occasion. "And you were arrested as Jean Harris?" She said, "Yes." "And that was the name you bear on the jail records?" "Yes." "And in Melbourne you took the name of Jessie Minton?" "I took that name to shield my husband." "What name did you assume when you came back to Sydney?" "Jean Harris?" "No." "But you did when arrested?" "Yes." "And you went to Melbourne to avoid suffering the penalty?" "I was in a certain condition at the time." "In February 1927 you were charged with receiving." She said the goods, were given to me to take to someone else. "You were found guilty?" "Yes." "And sentenced to 12 months hard labour?" Mrs. Mulholland remained silent. "And when you completed your sentence, you were sent to a reformatory. In March 1929, you were found guilty of riotous behaviour and damage to property and sentenced to 6 months. "Yes, in the prison. I was worried about my child." "Did your husband say you could have the child for 6 months to see if you could go straight?" "No, nothing of the sort." "You were arrested at Coogee for stealing from David Jones?" "No, for goods in custody, for having things my husband wouldn't say he had given me." "You were convicted on the 17th of February 1932 for stealing 10 pairs of stockings from David Jones?" "Yes." "You were fined on that charge?" "Yes." "They took your fingerprints that time?" "Yes." "And you gave the name of Sybil White?" "Yes." "And the police found you were identical with Jean Harris, who'd absconded from bail?" "Certainly not." On the 18th of April 1932, you were convicted at the Sydney Quarter Sessions for breaking and entering and sentenced to 3 years? "Yes, because my husband knew my hands were tied." She dramatically said, "I gave myself up to start life afresh." His Honour asked, "You told us that you were declared an habitual criminal." She said, "Yes, that was over the stockings and the breaking and entering, although I really didn't do it." Mr. Patterson asked, "You were convicted in Melbourne in April 1925. "Yes." "On 8 counts of housebreaking and stealing?" "Yes." The first of the witnesses to be called, Mrs. Bessie Hunt, a Rozelle resident, then took a seat in the rostrum. In her opening testimony, she recalled that she'd known Mrs. Mulholland for 4 years and originally had met her in Melbourne. Reverting to Mulholland, this witness informed the court that she'd seen him at the Leichhardt Stadium on many occasions in 1931 on a Friday night with the same girl. Dark, aged 23 to 24, and not as tall as Mr. Mulholland. All necks in the public benches craned when Mr. Little told an usher to call Molly O'Brien. Miss O'Brien straightaway appeared. "That's the Leichhardt Stadium girl," announced Mrs. Hunt once more from the witness stand. Mrs. Mulholland had a spell back in the witness box. Mr. Patterson asked her, "Were you at any time friendly with Miss O'Brien?" She said, "Before I knew she was so deceitful, I was." Mulholland's sister, Mrs. Lena Eunice Valentine, a woman of noble proportions, swore that at no time had her brother had any woman stopping at the Hampton Court flat, and that Miss O'Brien had never been inside the door there in her life. Miss O'Brien said that she'd been employed by him for the last 6 years. She was 19 years old when she first came into the business and always addressed him as Vic. Mulholland did admit, however, that he had taken Miss O'Brien to trade dances, but this had been in the company of others. "Did you ever give her presents?" He said, "Yes, at Christmas time I'd give her a couple of pairs of shoes." "Do you remember an incident in Oxford Street when your wife and Molly O'Brien came to blows?" And he smiled. Mr. Mulholland said that it was not true that he'd assaulted Mrs. Mulholland so that she'd had to go to hospital, and he did not suggest that she give herself up to the police. And furthermore, he had not told her that Miss O'Brien was in a certain condition. Miss O'Brien denied conduct with Mulholland, swearing that she'd never been with him either at Hampton Court or Grosvenor Flats. She denied all incidents appertaining to the description the wife had in connection to herself. And on the 19th of March 1933 in the Sydney Truth, Mrs. May Eileen Mulholland, a parson's daughter, as the judge described her, became an enemy of society. Married to a well-known boot manufacturer, she had the world at her feet but kicked it away. She sought a life of adventure and crime, forgot her early upbringing in a country parsonage, forgot her education, and seared the lines of worry on the face of the man, Victor Horace Mulholland, who made her his wife, and was prepared to give her all the comforts that the world could provide. Both Mulholland and Molly O'Brien's names were cleared when the judge delivered the judgment last week. The judge delivered lucidly and fully a finding in the bootman's favour. The judge said that in regard to the claims of adultery, that the case was not proved at all. The petitioner seems to be a well-meaning, tolerant man, and I think he speaks the truth. The respondent I did not rely on. She did not intend to live with the petitioner when released from jail. I think that when she took the position as a nurse in 1926, she intended to break off the relationship with her husband. "She is a strange woman," he observed, "well-spoken, apparently educated, but her life seems to have taken a strange turn of attempting to steal and be an enemy of society." The judge went on to say that he did not accept the evidence of some of the wife's witnesses as to the associations that allegedly took place. Custody of the boy was given to the husband, but the question of access was deferred until later. "It may be," says the judge, "that when this woman comes out of prison, she may want access to the child." It was a hands-down win, but what made him happy the most was the fact that his boy is now permanently in his hands. And on the 6th of August 1933, so 6 months after the divorce judgment, in the Sydney Truth, there was a ding-dong fight in the women's prisoners section at Long Bay Jail recently when Ethel Benn, who had an episode of her own, episode 247, and Eileen Mulholland, recently divorced by her husband, got into Holt's. Punches were exchanged in a wild slogging match, but Ethel Benn's footwork has slowed down a lot. She was not good enough against a more active opponent and was forced to take the count. The brawl took place at breakfast time, evidently due to carelessness of some description, for all the prisoners were supposed to be locked in at the time. The latest report from Long Bay is that Ethel Benn has recovered from her injury, which at one stage was expected to be of a serious nature, as it was feared that her eyesight would be impaired. Interestingly, Victor married Mary O'Brien in 1936. She was 16 years younger than Victor. They went on to have 2 sons of their own, Brian Douglas Mulholland in 1938 and Barry William Mulholland in 1940. Eileen was released on the 10th of May 1934. She seemed to settle for a while, but on the 27th of May 1940, under the name Vera Wilmot, she was charged on 4 counts of larceny in Melbourne and given 12 months jail. She was released on the 1st of April 1941 and she married Oscar Arnfeld Antonine Mould, an engineer in Sydney in 1944. Oscar was 2 years younger than Eileen. On the 9th of March 1946, in the Newcastle Morning Herald, a miner's advocate. In Gosford, a man and his wife narrowly escaped being burnt on the Pacific Highway south of Gosford late tonight when the car in which they were travelling to Sydney caught fire. Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Mould of Bellevue Hill had pulled up to change a tyre. Mr. Mould removed the spare when his wife stepped from the front seat. A second later, the car was enveloped with flames and within a few minutes was a charred mess. Eileen was living alone in Sydney in 1949 through to 1954 with Oscar farming on their country property. On the 25th of November 1953 in the Macleay Argus at Bellingen, the well-appointed country home of Mr. Oscar Mould at Thora was destroyed by fire in the early hours of Monday morning. Mr. Mould, who with other neighbouring farmers had been watching and combating the bushfires in the vicinity, slept on the front veranda so he could watch the position. The fire apparently came from behind and the house was well alight when he woke. He was not able to reach the phone inside to contact neighbours. The house and its contents, owned by Mrs. May Mould of Bellevue Hill, were insured. In 1958, they were living together as well as with her son Victor in Drummoyne, New South Wales, and then they moved to Carrum, Victoria. Eileen died on the 21st of March 1967 at Trawalla, Victoria, aged 72. After her death, Oscar lived with Victor at Katoomba, New South Wales, where Victor ran a guest house. Victor did not marry and died at the age of 69 on the 3rd of October 1996 at a destitute men's shelter in Wagga Wagga that's run by the St Vincent de Paul Society.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.